right, great. Well, thank you all. I am particularly excited with the topic of our final policy forum for today. I think this is an issue that is growing in urgency and importance, and also there is a lot of really interesting technical and policy actions that are happening. And so I have a great panel here with me, who today we're going to talk about the connection between space weather and orbital trajectory predictions. What we really want to look at in this session is current space weather prediction capabilities, what our practices are for atmospheric density modeling, and then what is the impact that both of these things have on the accuracy of SSA and conjunction warning. So really something that spans a topic that's of interest to a lot of our different audiences who are here today. I have a great panel joining me to talk about all of these things. I have Marco Concha, who is the Flight Dynamics Lead at Amazon Kuiper. I have Sue Fong, a space scientist from the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center. I have Piyush Mehta, an associate professor from West Virginia University, and Matt Shoup, senior associate of commercial space strategy at Booz Allen Hamilton. What I'd like to do is start off with a discussion and a chance for each of the speakers to lay out their thoughts on this issue. I realize this is something that some of you know a lot about, and some of us have probably not thought about at all. And so I want to treat this as kind of a discussion of like, what's the problem? What are we currently doing, and what else do we need to be doing in the future to address this so that all of our communities have what they need in order to be able to operate, et cetera. So Sue, I'd like to start with you. Can you share your perspectives, including your research regarding the 2022 Starlink incident that Ms. Melroy referenced in her remarks? What are the current practices for atmospheric density modeling, and what impact do these have on both the accuracy of SSA and conjunction warnings?
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. And this is my second AMOS, so I'm still very new to the SSA and all this community. However, I think Space Weather Prediction Center is under Department of Commerce and NOAA and National Weather Service. So National Weather Service's main mission is to provide weather information to protect life and properties and the economy of the nation. So I think space weather falls into that domain as well. So since the 2022 Starlink event, we have been working with Starlink very closely to evaluate the environment that they are flying. So it gives us a very good opportunity to learn how the mega constellation companies operating in different spaces. And I think they learn a lot, working with us, understanding the risk and reduce their risk. So I think that has been a very exciting 2 years. The other thing is we're working with Starlink very closely to see how we can convert their ephemeris data and onboard calculation so that we can back derive that environment to put into our model, operationalize, using data simulation to improve the environmental information we can provide. And there's a talk later today on that subject. And the other thing is we actually had a lot of other activities. So last year we called for a test-based engagement at Space Weather Prediction Center. We're bringing customers, we're bringing industrial partners and various government agencies to work with us. We went through Space Weather 101, impact on satellites, not just drag, radiation environment as well, right? So how do we mutually have that common ground, understand what's the impact? And the other thing is we also released our first neutral density forecast and nowcast model last year, and I'm trying very hard to get that into the community. And there are a lot of things happening the past 2 years. However, the neutral density part, there's still a lot of problems, right? So we understand that I think a lot of people here understand the Haston model, the high accuracy satellite drag model, will remain in the government domain. So how do we make sure everybody has a common ground, unified neutral density model to be utilizing for SSA conjunction analysis is something we are pushing very hard. In terms of forecast, we have lots of gap. Due to lack of data, we have only couple of spacecraft that operationalize in real time between Sun and the Earth. So pretty much blind if those one died during any event. So with lack of data, gaps in predicting the solar event to the Earth, we don't have a good way. We actually have tools, but we have low confidence on the storm arrival time. I almost cannot tell you the magnitude of the storm when it comes tomorrow. So I think there are a lot of limitations that I want the community to really understand and really advocate for us to how we can do a better job in the future. So our goal next step from Space Weather Prediction Center is really producing a probability forecast instead of a deterministic forecast that is probably always wrong. So I think that there's a goal that we're trying to move, and I want the community to be ready for that, and we'll have to go together.
All right, thank you. Thank you for being absolutely clear in what we can and cannot do, but also some of the efforts, and we'll return to some of what your office is working on. Piyush, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your research, which is focused extensively on this issue. Can you lay out for the audience the technical and operational issues that exist when predicting the effects of space weather on SSA? You know, what are the current gaps, particularly in terms of sharing data among various stakeholders that our first speaker already alluded to?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Crystal and team, for organizing the panel and inviting me on here. I think Sue did a great job laying the groundwork here. I'm going to expand on what Sue kind of started. So if we look at things historically, SSA operations and data sharing or stakeholder engagement has been primarily one-directional, right? DoD reaching out to the operators with conjunction messages, and there was not really a mainstream way to kind of receive feedback from the operators on that concept. And so the space weather system that DoD used or uses also even today is the HASDM system, the high accuracy satellite drag model. And that system has several challenges and limitations, right? On the technical side of things, it's limited in its fidelity because it's used empirical models which are climatological. And also another capability is lacking that D.A. Melroy kind of stressed on is lack of robust uncertainty quantification. There is no good way of quantifying the uncertainty in forecasts, which is critical for tracking and conjunction. And the final one is that it's not available in the public domain, so it's not available to public or private communities, right? So which makes, again, collaboration, coordination challenging. And so, as we know, recently, the recent trend in terms of deployments of constellations have really targeted more so the mid-LEO to low-LEO regime. Historically, most of the satellites were concentrated at 700 kilometers or higher, where the sensitivity of operations is significantly limited to space weather. But with the new constellations going to much lower LEO altitudes, the sensitivity of operations to space weather is significantly at risk now. And this lack of transparency, this lack of capability is no longer technically acceptable for us. And so the other point that I wanted to raise, and I think Sue also kind of touched at that, is this idea of consistent operations. If historically the way DoD ran things is they did their own analysis, and once CDMs are put out to the operators, they conduct their own analysis. They don't always match because they are using different models in the background, different algorithms in the background. So the DoD might suggest, or HASDM might suggest that there is a close event, but when the operator does its own analysis, they may not see the same thing at all. So it might be an apples to orange comparison. So this idea of consistent operations where everybody uses the same set of models and algorithms, I think is another limitation that we need to address. So I'll sum it up there.
Yes, I'd like to point out, so far, we've painted a pretty dire picture. We don't have enough data. We don't communicate well about it, and we're all working on different models. So I just want us to talk about that because there is some good news coming. But I want to be clear that this is a pretty serious issue, which is why we're here talking about it with you today. Marco, I'd like to go to you next. As an operator in the process of deploying one of these very large constellations, what concerns do you have regarding the available data and modeling, regarding SSA and space weather?
Yeah, thanks. For those of you in the room who don't know, Amazon Project Kuiper is a low Earth orbit constellation being deployed very soon. We have 2 protoflight satellites in orbit at the moment. They've proven out a lot of technology. We're building upon that and starting to manufacture. We have a manufacturing facility in Kirkland, Washington, starting to roll them out. So very soon we'll be in the business of launching many, 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 many satellites, of 3,236 eventually. So we followed with interest the events that Sue was involved with Starlink. In my experience, we have always considered space weather important in terms of things like propellant budgets and lifetimes and performance, certainly with regards to orbit uncertainty and prediction. But that's, in my experience, has always been sort of a given messiness, right? Drag is the biggest issue. What we started to see coming out of SWIPC is that we could learn a lot. We could more accurately predict in response to space weather events. And that was, to me, very interesting and eye-opening. So I turned some attention to have been participating with NOAA's efforts, even though we only had at the time 0 spacecraft, now it's 2. So it holds a lot of promise. What does it hold promise for? It holds promise that a lot of times there's a bit of a fog of war when there's a big storm. Like, and back in the days when I was flying spacecraft at NASA, it was, there's dozens of spacecraft that we'd worry about. Now it's coming up to thousands. So I think the congested nature of LEO exacerbates this problem. Where if you haven't encountered it before, or if you haven't worried about it too much before, or haven't heard very much about it before, it's not uncommon for an operator to lose contact. Pass will be lost, and I don't know how much situational awareness everyone else has, but people don't talk about when they lose a spacecraft for a day or two, or well, imagine that at scale. So when we saw the Starlink issue with the very, very large storm, we started paying attention to, like, will that happen to us? So we've folded in some of the initial prototype models that Piyush has been working with into an analysis set, and we actually have come up with a pretty good standard to say, well, if the space weather is this high as it's measured, based on this model, we probably shouldn't launch in certain parts of the day. And we think that's really valuable. Long term, though, however, reducing that fog of war is going to help coordinated activities of thousands and thousands of satellites in LEO. Some of the talks about orbital carrying capacity earlier this week, I think you can see it as taking knowledge in any way you can and shrinking that uncertainty. So this is an element in that, and we think it has a lot of promise.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it in terms of shrinking uncertainty. And I also want to highlight the importance of, you were saying, it's both for operations, but also especially during launch, right? That this isn't just on orbit. It's particularly important at that time too. I want to turn to Matthew now and look at this from a slightly broader commercial perspective. What would you like to add here in terms of how we are currently approaching SSA data more broadly and in this area? And where do you see the opportunities for commercial organizations to contribute to the problem we're here discussing?
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, so looking at what was mentioned earlier, starting with HASDM, the high accuracy satellite drag model, which has been kind of the generally referred to as kind of the gold standard for orbital propagation accuracy over the past 20 years or so. It's been very useful, but also there is the limitation that was stated that it is not available for general public usage due to the classification that it's at. What makes HASDM unique, just to cover that for a second for those who may not be familiar with it, HASDM is an entirely different type of drag model compared to more standard drag models that if you are a satellite operator or commercial SSA company in your flight dynamics ground segment, when you have your modeling and simulation, your orbit propagation software, the drag models and basically all those software that I know of, they only take in data from the sun to update the atmospheric model. HASDM takes that, plus it actually takes direct measurements of atmospheric density values just from tracking satellites in space and fitting orbits, if you know enough properties about the satellite. So it kind of combines two things in one. And that's why it's been so unique over this period of time. Now, the question is, can we have a publicly available or a commercial version equivalent of that? And I think that's a huge area where, and I'll expand to, I would say it's broader than just commercial. It could be commercial companies, academic institutions, research, civil government as well. We just want something that's available kind of en masse, that's accessible to the community. And the data assimilation required for that means we need data on objects in orbit. Now, what was different 20 years ago when HASDM first started compared to today? There was no commercial constellations, there was nothing, no commercial SSA companies tracking things, it was only the DoD using the Space Surveillance Network. Today, wildly different story, right? We have thousands of satellites that are commercial, we have commercial SSA companies that are tracking tens of thousands of objects in low Earth orbit with radars or telescopes. All of that data can be used, some of it. You have to do it on a subset of objects that you know properties of the object about. But that data can be used into assimilative models, right? That we can fold into some of the work that is going on here and be able to offer that to the community. So, for example, SpaceX and Spire have been very generous over the past couple of years in providing their GPS data and supporting data to research institutions for their constellations to use for this exact purpose, right? So if you have GPS data and you know the mass and the size and shape and orientation of the satellite, you can actually reduce back out of that the atmospheric density along the arc of the trajectory itself. And then multiply that by 6,000 satellites or more. It's very effective. Likewise, for commercial SSA companies that are tracking objects from ground-based radar telescope networks, same sort of thing. And in addition to the data itself, there's also algorithm development, there's high-performance computing, there's lots and lots of opportunities here for collaboration, very targeted collaboration to work together and to create a new model that we can have to the public, which I think is actually some work that this team here is working on.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. And that's kind of where I want to turn next. And I also want to invite you all, if you have comments or reactions to each other, of course, feel free to jump in. But I do want to dive a little bit more into what's currently being done, which we've started to touch on. But I think it's really key. We're sitting here in Solar Maximus. We have a solar cycle. And I think many of us, even if you don't follow solar news, you saw that we've all been seeing the northern lights at very low altitude. So it's in the public awareness at the moment. And so, what are we trying to do now to address some of these issues? And so I'll start with you, Sue. Building on everyone's excellent remarks, what steps has NOAA really started taking? I know you've changed a lot in the last few years. And can you share with us what your approach is, both from a national perspective, but then also how you're coordinating internationally, because space weather is something that's studied and worked on all over the world?
So space weather have international impact, right? Global impact. So we don't just look at space weather impact in the US soil, right? So I think that's why naturally our office has been working with international partners and allies together, like UK is our core partners. And we also work with Japan, Korea, and Australia, and many other countries together to monitor the environment. You got to have all the ground station cover that viewpoint all the time. And you want to work together to spin off tools to do forecasting, as well as to do missions together. There are a lot of costly missions that we need to put out together. So I think international collaboration is the key for space weather, and my office has been working a lot on that. And there's one important activity going on is to revise the space weather scale. I mean, if anybody understands space weather scale, or you go to our website, you can see that it kind of tailored to different industry on different impact of the space weather event. But that is set up 25 years ago. So things are changed. Things are very different. And the technology changed. So things impact your technology 20 years ago might not be a problem anymore. So I think that activity is something we are working internationally right now. But I want to point out that our community has very little understanding of what you guys are doing, right? So in the past 2 years, what we have been doing is, let's try to convert this environmental specification and forecast to this community, right? So how do we do that? Because if you keep on doing that, staying in environmental domain, there's no impact on your operation. You have no idea what that means when this thing goes up. So working with Office of Space Commerce closely within NOAA, I think that's the strategy we're taking on, is really able to integrate some of these tools and alert and warnings into their system or even their website, and work closely together. Their ops floor gonna be in the same building with Space Weather Prediction Center once it's built in Boulder, Colorado. So I think there are a lot of synergy that can happen. And the other thing is, through overseeing a lot of projects in the past few years and working with industrial partners, I think everybody has a role to play here. Everyone in the room has a role to play. Share your data, share your algorithm, share your tracking data, whatever you can. If you can share in real time and tiny manner, we'll try to figure out how to use it. And we gotta get smarter to how to use the data is already there instead of launching more stuff to monitor that environment, right? So getting used to data. So government needs to be able to come up with the agile program. We actually lack of that. And procurement process. So that allowed us to work with partners and data provider in a tiny manner. We're just not doing that right now. So how does government change to interact with people in the right pace to build program is very important. Thank you.
I like that. Share your data. All right, now I want to turn to Piyush and look at the same question, but from the academic perspective. What areas of research are you and others in the field actively pursuing, and how do you think that's going to help?
So, like Crystal said, we started off grim, but it's not all grim, right? There is a lot that is happening, that has been happening over the last several years. Speaking of the space weather community side of things, there is certainly an increased recognition within the US Congress, but also internationally as well, for the impacts of space weather on SSA. So Congress passed the ProSwift Act back in 2018, which directed the federal agencies to invest in mitigating the impacts of space weather, which includes obviously for the SSA community as well. OSC was charged with taking over commercial operations, so that's also certainly movement in the right direction. There is significant research advances happening in the space weather academic community and the SSA academic community as well. And finally, none of this, like Sue said, can happen without collaboration between the government partners, industry, and academia, right? So we all need to kind of come together and come up with the right solution that is required for us to move forward. So that's going away from the grimness of the situation, making sure that we're also talking about all the good things that are happening. But also on the good side of things, what Matt mentioned, right? There are certain characteristics within HASDM that are very critical. They teach us lessons, and we can leverage as well. So in the context of taking what we've done or what we are doing in terms of research and transitioning to operations, which is what we, at least in the space of the community, would commonly refer to as R2O, right? What we are trying to do through several efforts, including efforts supported by OSC, we are trying to leverage some of the capabilities of HASDM, including the data assimilation side of things, and develop a framework similar to HASDM, which obviously is a little bit more advanced, or a lot more advanced on the technical side of things, leverages the advantages of HASDM itself, and then leverages the openness that the industry is bringing by sharing data. Like Matt was saying, we can use all the data that's already available from these constellations, potentially even debris objects, to de-bias our models, to correct our models, and improve predictions and forecasts, right? So what we are doing in my group, essentially, and I had a talk yesterday, but I said developing what we are calling the next generation keyword probabilistic drag modeling framework, right? Which is going to, again, be very similar to HASDM, have similar components, but we are enhancing them by, one, improving the fidelity of the models. We are trying to leverage physics-based models, which are going to be providing higher fidelity, especially during storm conditions, which is the critical time that we need the system to work well, as well as providing uncertainty all along the workflow, right? So starting from the drivers, the solar drivers, the geometry drivers, the density models, and also developing or using the algorithms to effectively integrate that uncertainty information in the orbit determination and prediction processes, right? So those are the kind of things that we are working on, at least in my group, in terms of research towards making this advance. But again, I will end with saying, none of this is possible without close collaboration between every stakeholder, every entity present in this room and outside, that cares about SSA, that cares about the impact of, that cares about space weather, cares about SSA, and cares about the impact of space weather and SSA.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So now, I know that Booz Allen is taking kind of a multifaceted approach to this issue. And so I was curious, what can you share about some of those initiatives and specifically what they hope to accomplish?
Sure. So yeah, at Booz Allen, we have a number of initiatives that are internally funded that we're progressing forward under the research and development, as you said, the phrase of research into operations, that are focused on the topics that we're talking about here. So I can share a couple of those and our stance on that. But one of them is that Booz Allen is very strong in AI and machine learning, and we want to apply our expertise to see what problems we can solve in this specific topic area. And to do that, you need data to train on, and luckily there's lots and lots of public data that is very useful for these purposes. So one effort that we have ongoing right now, it's been going for a few months and is getting towards the later stages of development, is that we are taking data from NASA's SDO satellite, which takes images of the sun every few seconds and has been doing so for many years. We've collected a 10-year data set of those images. I think the total is 330-ish thousand images of the sun over a 10-year period. And we've built a vision transformer model, I think is the term, to essentially take an image of the sun and then correlate historically how that image of the sun mapped to the predicted solar indices values that came, some few hours later, right? And then train that 10 years worth of data on that, with the goal being once that model is complete, you get a new image of the sun that pipes in every few seconds, and then the model will churn out the predicted solar indices values from that. And then you can make a full sort of ML ops pipeline from that to do all stages, potentially even from like sun to OD, where you have a model of solar activity that is coupled to a model of atmospheric drag that is also coupled to an orbit determination process and running within a singular pipeline. So that's one development effort that we have going on. And another one, and I think we're going to keep repeating the word collaboration here because it's very important, but we are heavily collaborating with multiple other space companies, many of which are actually here, to leverage what we are good at and add what they are good at, and other services where we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? We want to make the most use of our time and efforts there. So we are, as two examples, we are collaborating with companies like Space Environment Technologies, where we're accessing their solar and geomagnetic indices data to pull into some of our prototype modeling platforms and study orbital propagation accuracies there. We're also doing a similar thing starting soon with Orion Space Solutions, where we'll be accessing their dragster software and doing similar efforts. So larger scale benchmark testings using truth ephemeris data, where you can essentially propagate a state using, say, for example, the standard NRL MSIS 2000 model, and then also propagate it again using that same model, but with dragster's density corrections applied to it, see what the deltas in improvement are, do that at scale, and then ultimately the goal of it is to, if those efforts are successful, to fold in some of those capabilities into some of our offerings for our customers there.
So we've heard about efforts now to understand the problem better, to figure out how we can improve forecasting and understand where we are and where we need to be, and then to really try to integrate all of those things together. Now I want to turn to Marco as an operator again, and given these current resources and capabilities, how are you planning to integrate space weather considerations specifically into your operational plans? Like, what can you tell us about how you've thought about what you're designing and about to launch?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The old way, right, is to take an 81-day average of what you think is going to be the case, and then you you use that in your propagation, 1/2 rho v squared estimation of drag. It's different. You have an OD orbit determination loop that says, oh, that was a little off, and we calibrate. There's a lot of uncertainties involved in terms of that final solution versus what you expected, and we usually soak that all up in drag. What I care about is now in that loop is reducing all of the factors that make that error large. And for me, that's a lot of data that's input, Earth orientation parameters, the space environment that factors into that. But also what's part of that, and also what's part of that too, and one of the reasons why we're all here, I guess, some of us anyway, is the data stream that comes in terms of situational awareness data, CDMs, with regards to conjunction risks in the future. So this is all part of that. I'm mentioning a lot of data streams that come in. And so while we'll fold in the models that we expect to improve, and we'll certainly participate in contributing our data as it assists this problem, this research, and any other research really, because we're trying to be as open as possible with that sort of information. What I really care about is that whole feedback loop of how quickly can I make a decision, how quickly do I have updated data, and if that cycle, if those of you used to flying spacecraft, that's usually on an 8-hour cycle. The HASDM gets updated, I think, every 8 hours. The CDM's screening gets done on an 8-hour cadence. That's because of humans in the loop. It makes a lot of sense historically. We're now in a situation where this is being done algorithmically, and what matters is the nowcast. And forecasts are great if they're super accurate. We don't expect them to be, just like hurricane modeling, we don't expect for the variability of the sun. It's like modeling the wind, So I can program a drone to get from here to there to deliver a pizza, but it's not a deterministic path if there's wind, right? So we have to be able to respond to it. And I think the way to respond to that is the feedback loop. A control algorithm can see that there's a disturbance and it corrects to a reference. So I think, to me, reducing the latencies, you heard Eric at SpaceX say something very similar, and his experience flying 6,000 spacecraft, I think, holds from what we're seeing. So my advice to this community is improve the models, we'll play along, we'll contribute to that solution, but pay a lot of attention to the throughput you're going to need for API machine-to-machine interfaces and standardizing those interfaces so that if all the operators adopt 1 hour, 2 hour update latency, or even smaller, let's say, because our orbit determination processes are on that order. and we can correct for the wind very quickly with that type of capability in hand. Thank you.
All right, that actually tees us up great to switch over to audience questions. And one of the first ones that I think is really key, we talked a little bit about this at the dialogue yesterday. I've observed this personally myself. So the question is, are the heliophysics and space operators communities able to communicate effectively about each other, about the former's capabilities and the latter's needs? And as a kind of a moderator's privilege, like, I want to observe that in the Washington sphere, when the space weather community, which is very active, there's a great set of people who are trying to engage the White House and Congress and that sort of thing. We've held events and up until very recently, trying to get an operator to show up at a space weather event in Washington was not simple for a lot of reasons, right? And I think that's changed. And so I'm curious what all of your impression is on this question. Like, how do these communities currently communicate? How can we do that better? We talked a lot about collaboration, but what are the gaps? What are the challenges to that?
I'll address that real quick. I think historically a lot of the work that we sit on top of comes from legacy institutions, FFRDCs, and research development in government and science institutions, and they were very mission driven towards science, very mission driven toward fundamental research, and I think as Deputy Administrator Melroy talked about, when you have that legacy, you have an organization structure that's different than a customer-driven supportive operations. That's a different thing. And that's something I think the 18th has struggled with in the DoD. Their primary mission is something different that those radars serve. So if we can solve that problem, then a lot of this gets. I'd love to engage with the space and environment community in Washington D.C. if they cared about what I care about. So, yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a very important question, and certainly in the space weather community, there is recognition over the last several years of closely engaging. That's why, I know R2O is not a new term, but it has a lot more impetus lately, especially in the space weather community. So it's certainly recognition that, like Marco said, we want to develop products that are going to serve the customers in the end that are going to end up using this, right? And so historically, they were driven by science desires and scientific investigations. We wanted to answer science questions. But I think certainly there is a lot more recognition across communities. I can't speak for the governmental boundaries that agencies might have, but I know that there is certainly active recognition that we need to engage, and this is where this idea of doing everything as a team between all the actors and making sure we communicate openly so that the right solutions can be derived and developed.
Maybe I'll add something. I would just say, I've been telling people my life used to be easier when I was just a scientist. I don't need to understand your problem. I don't need to understand why you need it, because I can just tune my model, do whatever I want to do. But that's still a mindset with a lot of people in my community, right? So I started to ask hard questions. What is the problem? What do we need? And what is accuracy we're looking for? We always say that ionosphere impact GPS signals. Is it really impacting GPS signal? Depends on technology, right? So I think those questions, there are a lot of questions I couldn't even find the answer sitting at Space Weather Prediction Center or sitting in that community. And I think those are hard questions that actually a lot of scientists don't want to deal with it. And I think I started asking all of you this question, whether or not you want to answer. And then some companies get my email every storm because they don't answer my question. So I'll keep on going to them and can you please tell me what happened? And I think I just want to tell everybody, there's a need to share proprietary information when you want to let me know how your technology being impacted. If you don't share that information, I have no obligation to help you out, right? So actually transparency and understand and trust the government that we're building things for you, for your own benefit, not for my benefit. That is a very key component right now. And I think we've been quite successfully in the past 2 years, and that hopefully helped the whole community moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about trust on both sides, that it's about everybody kind of coming out of their shell. Like scientists, it's easy to focus on your data, it's easy to focus on your research, it's easy to focus on the question that you want to answer. And you have to sort of work towards applied science in a different way on a topic like this. But on the flip side, then it's also building those relationships and understanding that that means sharing information and working together in a different way. So I think that's an insightful point about what's needed on both sides, right? Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just related to the question about the framing of the importance of space weather. One thing we mentioned yesterday was when space weather comes up in conversation, oftentimes it is driven by discussions of cooperative satellite operations or spaceflight safety, that sort of thing. But it also plays a very important role in national security and space domain awareness. One of the core main tasks, that we have is we have to keep track of adversarial satellites, right? We have to monitor their activity, monitor them through maneuvers. That gets challenging the lower and lower you go in altitude. It becomes just more difficult, especially if you're using ground-based sensors. We've seen an uptick in popularity somewhat so far, but it seems the trajectory is upward that VLEO will only become a more and more utilized domain. And in the effects of space weather there, coupled with the challenges of tracking objects there that are non-cooperative and probably have high delta V capabilities, to me that compounds the importance of having very strong space weather models so that we can keep track of those objects. And ultimately what we don't want to be in is a situation where we didn't pay enough attention to that, and our adversaries can keep track of our satellites better than we can keep track of theirs because of we weren't keeping up with the best space weather modeling capabilities. So yeah, just the importance of related to the protect and defend mission that space weather actually plays.
I see you actually anticipated another one of our questions. I want to give you and others.
Can I say something, follow up to that? I think
Absolutely.
It makes a very important point, right? Predicting auroras is cool. We want to be able to view it, right? But that does not necessarily have a real societal impact per se, right? And oftentimes, because that's what the public's kind of more interested in, and that kind of the space weather discussions kind of revolve around those, and we miss pointing them in the right direction or what the true impacts, technological and human impacts of space weather can be. So I think it's important to continue to have these conversations, important to have this education and make sure that everybody's kind of understanding things properly.
Yeah, so I'd like to pull on that a little bit more, because one of our questions actually is specifically about the national security issue. So it seems like this is a national security issue. If space weather affects SSA, then doesn't it complicate the tracking of all objects, including those of rivals? And so Matt and anyone else, I'll give you an opportunity to kind of expand on your previous comments, and then I also have a story that I like to reference on this one. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is certainly yes. If you look at, just to dive into it a little bit more, if you look at the current state, both on the government and commercial sensor networks that we use to track non-cooperative objects with, virtually 100% of them are ground-based, whether that's radars or telescopes or passive RF, whatever it may be. But when you look at the simple geometry of what's happening, when you fly at a lower altitude, you can end up literally flying under the radar or the telescope, although that doesn't have the same ring to it. But you can essentially avoid detection simply by flying at lower altitudes. And then at those low altitudes, you have just the compounded effects of drag, to where if an adversary wanted to do something sneaky and say launch a sub-satellite object or do an RPO with some other object, VLEO is not a bad place to do it for a few reasons. If you want to evade detection, it's an area that I think we'll see a lot of SDA-related activity in for the upcoming years. Obviously, the advantages of VLEO being very high resolution imagery of the Earth, even lower latency for communications, et cetera. Now that we have more capable propulsion systems that are electric, and you can do lots and lots of continuous low thrust burns to maintain your altitude, I think that regime is going to grow more popular. And so we can mitigate that a few different ways, putting more sensors. We can do space-based sensors looking down, but absolutely having a drag model that is assimilative, using multiple different types of data, but is also very responsive and near real time. Because in the event of shorter duration events like solar flares, where the density can change quite a bit over the course of, let's say, a few hours, we need to be able to have that granularity and have preferably no delay in that information, so that we can make the best predictions we can of what our adversaries might be doing.
Yeah, and I want to foot stomp this issue, because I actually think it's something that gets overlooked a little bit with space weather. So we all talk a lot about how uncertainty in space can lead to geopolitical tensions, right? Like, that's something that we generally acknowledge. But space weather is one of the few places where we actually have a documented case where that happened. So in the space weather community, there was, in 1967, there's a very, very famous, very large solar storm that caused a lot of problems on Earth and led to an escalation of the Cold War that could have ended very badly and ended up not. And eventually these documents became unclassified. You can read a paper by Dolores Knipp. I recommend it. It's fascinating stuff that will actually walk you through what happened during this incident. And we are not at the point where that could be completely avoided if we had a similar incident again. So I mean, this is an absolutely documented risk that exists both from the technological perspective, but also an opportunity for geopolitical misunderstanding. What's interesting to me is that that paper did not get a lot of attention in the space weather community, right? Like this was kind of, we all knew about it, it was a thing. But for this community, for others who are thinking about how we solve these problems, we cannot overlook the political aspects of this issue in addition to those that are technological. Related to that, I want to ask one more hard question that's on here. And several of you referenced the nature of our current space weather models being proprietary and not being shared publicly. But to be clear for those in the audience who are less familiar with the issue, one of these questions is quite frankly asking, why is that the case? Isn't this a case of perhaps not using taxpayer funds in a wise way? You know, why is that? And so I know this is a hard question, but I think it's important for the audience to understand that we've referenced it, we all know it to be true, but why is that?
Okay, so in terms of, we keep going back to, it seems like it's turned into a Hasdem butchering session, but I'll go back to the case of Hasdem again. So first case is that the underlying density model is an empirical model, which is a climatological model. So it, by definition, does not have predictive capabilities, right? It's not, the upper atmosphere is a dynamical system. It's an empirical model does not actually model, the model within Hasdem does not actually model it as a dynamical system. So that's one of the issues. And it cannot necessarily capture what Matt was just mentioning, those very quick changes that occur during a storm, right? So that is something physics-based models are good at, or supposedly good at, right? We believe intuitively and fundamentally, theoretically, that they should be able to capture that better. But that's what we're trying to test out. We're going to try to put it to test there. And there is one additional issue in terms of there has been significant talks about latency, and we can get to real-time updates to the model. But the issue is drag is an integrative effect, which means that it takes time for the effect of drag to show up in your measurements. And historically, because you are collecting data using limited sensors, which are radar sensors that are sparse, geolocated kind of sparsely, before you pick up the next one, drag might have not had a chance to have impact on your measurement away from the underlying two-body dynamics or whatever. And so that's why it was always collected over a series of hours, potentially 4 to 8 hours, before the measurements actually reflect that information about the environment. GPS measurements might change that and allow us to do things with more latency, but there is still that fundamental physical challenge of drag taking time to have an impact on the state, if that makes sense, from the last measurement.
Any other comments?
I actually have no answer. I've been asking around why, but I get a copy because I'm in government. So I think that is a truly issue with space weather. At Space Weather Prediction Center, every services, every data we use should go out. Everything is open. But our DoD partners will come, Space Force come to my office and say, when does space weather become a classified information that we need to lock it down as a nation? So I think that's a very interesting question on what kind of intelligence become classified when certain conditions happen. And I think I personally have not thought about that, but I think there are always some information that we don't want to get to the wrong place. And that might be the fundamental problem with some of this data sharing issue.
Interesting. All right. That actually kind of leads us to what I think will be our last audience question. And this is an opportunity to say, let's talk a little bit about how that collaboration happens within the government. So the question is, how is cooperation amongst various USG agencies? So how does SWPC work with the, what is happening internal? We talked a lot about the relation to commercial and SSA and SSA providers, but what's actually happening at the government level to coordinate these issues?
So there's a huge collaboration going on, and we're deeply stuck into this quad agency agreement. So that comes with NASA's NOAA and actually Air Force, as well as which one is the other one? No, OSC is actually under NOAA. So I think there are a lot of collaboration happening right now. And so I think there is things going on. But within federal agencies, it's still not very clear how we do this because everybody kind of look out a little apart. Forecasting is obviously our job. But how do we convert the research to operation together? I miss NSF. I think it's very important to bring out NSF. So NSF, NASA, and DOD as well as and NOAA. So I think kind of really work together to convert and getting the talent of the research all the way to operation. And that path is really, really hard. Being the fact that SWPC, I mean, I don't know if you know how big SWPC is. We have about 80 people that we have to maintain all the systems. Of course, we don't maintain spacecraft, but really get all the technology to a real-time support system and running 24/7 with staffed. It's a tricky problem. So I think we try, and we are working very hard on that, and we have a lot of tasks to do in the federal government. So it will take time, but we're getting there.
Absolutely. I lied. I'm going to ask one more question for Marco. So, we've been talking a lot about the need to share this data, right? And historically, so the question is, commercial operators have historically been resistant to share spacecraft anomaly data in an open and transparent way. How can we be collaborative given that? What is your guys' take on it? Where do you draw the line in terms of what you can and cannot share? And do you see opportunities for further collaboration, particularly on this area?
It is a tricky question. Building out a constellation and proving out that Amazon can fly satellites, for example, some skepticism there. Thank you. A corporate posture will be very protective, very safeguarding. That, however, Amazon as a company has a sustainability initiative that's terrestrial. We have a burgeoning space sustainability initiative that internal to the company that doesn't quite have the sea-level status like in other places I've seen, but is growing as awareness of this grows, as the importance of this community on that type of data sharing. We recently have, all of you I'm sure have an Amazon Prime account, well most of you do I guess, and so what you're buying getting delivered to your home or other places is extremely, extremely well protected within Amazon, as you can imagine you would want it to be. I do. So that means the internal corporate data policies are, I think, more restricted than the federal government's in terms of protecting customer data. So when, I'll tell you a little story if you just indulge me. When I showed up and I decided to say, okay, well, how can I get what I want to share? What makes obvious to those of you in this room, simple things, satellite ephemeris, right? Somebody had already gone into the system, I think our friends at AWS who have customers in this room, and has said, satellite ephemeris, customer data has to be super protected. So then there was a bit of a fight there, because my position was satellite ephemeris has to be more open and transparent, but respecting our customers' wishes, we have to create a new data classification, Kuiper satellite ephemeris. So, happy to announce that I won that battle, and now it's public information. We've been sharing that with TS Kelso and Celestrak since day one, as soon as I got the green light. We've recently got the information that's within a CDM has been declared public data, so that means we can publicly share CDMs. So look forward to that very soon. That is just a step in the right direction. Ultimately, anomaly data, we've been approached by many people for many reasons, looking for when things go wrong, to determine when is it the fog of war, when is it a space environment situation that could be miscategorized as a spoofing of GNSS services, for example. We have to get clarity on that, and I think anomaly data does share. That's going to be a harder thing to do, much harder. But it is something that if we can classify it and with the right stakeholders protecting the data at the same level Amazon protects your data, then I think we can get there. So that's all I'll say there. Thanks.
Yeah, it sounds like a challenge, but something that we understand and we need to continue to work on. So, but I think it's interesting to hear where the concerns come from within the companies, because it's not necessarily the engineers, right? It comes from a different place, and then that has to be figured out and managed and handled in a way that's reasonable for everyone. But as we have more and more commercial satellites, it is absolutely something that we need to take into account. So what I want to do to close this is to turn to the future question. So we've talked a lot about what the problem is, what we are doing about it, and started to touch on what we hope to do about it. But I really want to give all of my panelists an opportunity for you to share your thoughts on what else should we be doing. If you could, talk to Congress or talk to your stakeholders or talk to your boss, whoever it is, what is it that we aren't doing, and where do you see the holes in the future and that you would, really like to fix them? And remember, we're speaking to a room of technical professionals from across government, academia, industry. Like, this is the right audience to try to galvanize for where we see the holes here. So we'll just go down the line. I'll start with Matt on the end, but what would you like to see in the future, and by who?
Sure. So one thing that strikes me, and this was discussed in the dialogue a little bit as well, is the need for knowledge transfer, or doing a better job at that, between the research side of things, which has lots and lots of very useful information, knowledge transfer of how that space weather will actually impact satellite operations from a real, day-to-day practical sense. Even for myself included, there's a bit of a disconnect there. One example I'll share here as well too is if you, from a spaceflight safety perspective, if you go to spacetrack.org and you look at the Spaceflight Safety Handbook, which describes the 18th and 19th conjunction screening process for LEO, they break the altitudes into 4 different bins, and the lower you go, the larger the screening volume is because of uncertainty due to atmospheric drag. But the lowest bin for altitude, it's listed as less than 500 kilometers, right? But there's no lower bound to it. And I've spoken with satellite operators before, planning to launch a satellite into VLEO, and they indicated that the 18th had told them, we actually can't generate CDMs for you. You're just flying too low. And so it made me think, wow, what is the actual lower threshold where you have a relationship between the altitude you're flying at, the activity of the sun, and your operational procedures and reaction times for collision avoidance and spaceflight safety? What is the relationship there, right? What's the minimum altitude where once you go below a certain altitude due to drag and or solar activity, that it just really stops making sense to approach it in the traditional way? I do not know the answer to that, but I think there's a lot of really useful data and research being performed where there's been a bit of a disconnect between the ramifications of that research on day-to-day satellite operations. So I think the answer, is still going to be tighter collaboration and communication, and working to understand, just going that extra step to understand what the implications of that activity are, perhaps even making some documentation, or I think that's something that would actually be great for the TRACS website when that goes up, is to be able to share the impacts of that. Like, hey, if you're a satellite operator and you're flying below 600 kilometers, read this, and you need to understand how space weather and atmospheric drag are going to impact your satellite operations and what you need to do to be ready for that.
All right, Piyush?
It seems to me like the safe answer to this would be more funding. But I know that's never going to be enough for us, right? But I honestly do think that, since the ProSwift Act was established 2018, there has been a significant uptick in research support around this. There is also a significant acknowledgement of the desire to move things from research to operations. But again, like I said, there is always going to be more need for funding. But I know of several efforts across the community, nationally and internationally, at least in this context, that are awarded and ongoing. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think we have momentum. We have momentum right now. We need to put our foot on keep the foot on the pedal. But as the proverb says, it takes a village to raise a child. So I think we need to continue to work together collaboratively across the board, industry, academia, government, and make sure we have open discussions around the problems. If we solve a problem and it leads to another challenge, then we should also have open discussions around that, because that's very often going to be the case. Open dialogue, data sharing, all the good things. I think that would help.
I don't think it's wrong to point out the funding issue. Something else that came up yesterday on this topic was that space weather as a topic has actually done a pretty good job of making its case as a national priority. So because space weather also affects airplanes and power grids and things that affect people's lives in a very direct way, they can make a pretty effective case. But I think what we're hearing here is we're now immediately seeing the effects on our community and the need to improve and include our community's concerns in those funding requests. And that's perhaps where there's room for more growth. Right?
So space weather prediction is hard. A lot of time we talk about data, we still remain on nowcast, right? How do you forecast space weather? You gotta know what sun is doing tomorrow. And a lot of people come, I need 7-day forecast. I say, sunspot is behind the sun. I can't even see it. So I will lobby more spacecraft, which we don't have money for, because I can't even see anything. Then how do I tell you it's coming? We try our best. May storm, we actually know it 3 days in advance. We know it's coming. We know it's gonna be big. Our press release come out a day before, and people are prepared. And I get a lot of feedback. People say, because you guys tell us, we are prepared. So we're trying our best. But our forecaster also telling me, it's a little bit like you drop a basketball in California, on Pacific, and you go to the other side and see what will happen. And that's exactly what we're doing, is you look at this coming, but you don't have a 2-point vantage point also. And you're estimating when it will come, how big it will be, and not to mention the magnetic field structure of that plasma traveling through the space. So I think it's very challenging. But I think getting the funding to the right place, the key is sharing information, right? So if you are not able to share that impact with me or work with me on quantifying the impact of every storm, it's difficult for me to go all the way up to Congress and say, look, this is the problem. Because every time, even the May storm, I was being asked, there's no satellite falling out of the sky. I don't think there's a problem. I say, yeah, if they don't say there's a problem, we'll have no problem. So I think everybody has to bring in the feedback and work with us so that we can have a healthy community and funding situation on that.
I think what part of what you're saying too is it's the importance of storytelling and contextualizing, because it's not immediately affecting, no satellites are falling, it's not immediately killing anyone, but that doesn't mean they're not very real national security, infrastructure, and public effects of the problems here. So, all right, wonderful. Marco?
I wanted to plus one what Sue was saying. Whatever we can do to help, and make that case. Amazon's investing billions of dollars into an infrastructure that hopes to serve everybody in this room, and internationally, globally. So to the extent that we're impacted, somebody has to do that sort of impact study to say, is it 10, 50, $100 million? I don't know. But I'll get to the question though. What I'd like to see in the future is, and I'm seeing a lot of good signs of it, the fact that Zue sitting next to me is a great sign that the government is treating us as a bit of a customer. I work in a very customer-oriented organization where customer obsession is the word we use to not to anticipate what you need, but to what will delight you. Like what's gonna make you really happy in the future? If I can, and that becomes the process that we go work backwards from. And we see government now moving that way. The fact that NASA is now realigning to be sort of single-threaded operations, if you will, of what success will be. It's very, very promising. So as a constellation operator, to the extent, and we see really effective 24/7 operations to support the military. So our friends at the 18th do, and they didn't ask for that mission, but they're performing it. So I know the government can do it. So I'm looking forward to seeing a really customer-obsessed performance or focus on satellite operations and how we support it. The Space Weather Prediction Center website is where everyone went when those storms showed up. And everybody wanted to see, in Alabama, if I could see the aurora. We all did it, right? We all did it. That's the same website infrastructure that was reporting data to us. And it went down. So let's change that. That's the kind of thing that we can see improvements for, right? It's very simple, but it's a mindset. Are we doing research and development? Are we doing prediction? Or are we doing operations support? If we can align to, similar to the way the 18th is aligned to support operations of valuable assets, and I think as a commercial operation infrastructure we are, then that would make me very happy going forward. Thanks.
All right, well, those were some really great closing thoughts, so thank you all. Thank you to the audience. I hope you found this instructive and enlightening, and if we've piqued your interest on this topic, I'm happy to say there is also a paper session later today on space weather, so definitely recommend hearing what some of the fascinating and more detailed research. This was our attempt to kind of highlight the policy and ongoing operational issue for you, but there is a lot of great research already happening, so definitely encourage you to check that out. If you have further follow-up questions that I didn't get to for my audience, everyone is here here, and they're delightful people, so please feel free to track them down and ask your question. But again, thank you for your time today.